So look, I think it's a great question. Will there be more nuclear weapons powers in the future or less as a result of this decision by President Trump? So I actually think there'll be less. And I'll tell you it's succinctly as I can. And that is that it's been very clear from the Saudis, from the Turks, certainly from the even the Algerians and others, that if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, they too want a nuclear weapon. In fact, the Saudis have gone even further and said if Iran is allowed to retain the key enrichment capability that they have under JCPOA, that we want that too. If there's an Iran standard, we want the Iran standard. We don't want the gold standard. In fact, that's been the subject of intensive negotiations between the United States and Saudi Arabia for the past couple of years, both under Biden and Trump, as part of the U.S.-Saudi agreement, defense agreement, and economic agreement that has been underway. It's very clear that there's going to be a proliferation cascade in the Middle East if the Iranians get a nuclear weapon, and certainly if they're allowed to retain this enrichment capability. I also worry about, we haven't even talked about it at all, this conversation. I mean, the most important area in the world for the United States is not the Middle East, it's China and the Indo-Pacific. And I worry that the South Koreans, the Taiwanese, and the Japanese will say, you know what, we don't trust any U.S. commitments to stop nuclear weapons. You failed on Iran. We don't trust you. We don't trust your nuclear umbrella. We too want nuclear weapons in order to guard our security against China. And so what you would see, I hope it doesn't happen, but I worry about is this kind of proliferation cascade in the Middle East and in the Indo-Pacific, two of the most important areas for American national security, which is why I think it's very important that Iran's be stopped. Now, whether this attack succeeds in stopping Iran's nuclear weapon or accelerates it, we disagree, but I think neither of us know yet. Hard to predict. But what I think is absolutely certain is that if Iran develops that nuclear weapon and is allowed to retain the key capabilities to do so, you're going to see 5, 6 countries in the Middle East, at least 3, 4 countries in the Indo-Pacific asking for the same capability. And then you're going to have a club of nuclear weapons powers that will have an additional 5, 6, 7 over the next 10 to 20 years.
What if they don't? What if they're prevented? Doesn't that still send the same message to everybody that they should build?
Oh, I think it sends the opposite message, Lex. I think if they see what has happened and that it's successful and it stopped Iran from developing nuclear weapons, and in addition, Trump was able to negotiate an agreement for zero enrichment and full dismantlement, then the message to all these other countries is, number one, you don't need it. And number two, if you try to get it, then the United States is going to use American power. Now, I'm not suggesting the United States is going to start bombing the Saudis or the Turks or the Emiratis, clearly not the Japanese. I mean, many of them are our allies. But I think the United States retains many tools, counter-proliferation tools, to prevent these countries from developing nuclear weapons, including, sanctions and export controls and many of the things. And plus, I think those countries, understand that in the Middle East, despite Scott's focus on Israel, when you talk to Arab leaders, their biggest concern is the threat from Iran. It's not the threat from Israel. They're not concerned with the threat from Israel. That's why you had the Abraham Accords. This is why the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco entered into this peace agreement with Israel. The Saudis will one day, and they'll bring many other Arab and Muslim countries in it. They don't say Israel is a threat. They see Iran as a threat. And so if you counter that threat, you eliminate Iran's nuclear weapons proliferation and expansion, those countries now no longer have to build nuclear weapons capabilities to counter the Iranians. Now, we've also restored our credibility. We don't bluff. We said Iran doesn't develop nuclear weapons. They won't. And now it's the Japanese who have, as Scott rightly pointed out, they do have reprocessing and plutonium capabilities. The Taiwanese, who used to have a military nuclear weapons program and gave it up. And the South Koreans, who agreed to our gold standard, of zero enrichment, zero reprocessing, those three countries can now say, okay, we rely on the United States, on your word, on your power, and on your ability to actually turn words into action. We don't need nuclear weapons. So I'd say if successful, big if successful, then it's going to be a significant guard against the potential of greater nuclear proliferation, and we will have less nuclear weapons powers than we otherwise would have.
My favorite thing is when you guys point out when you agree with the other person. Anyway, Scott, what do you think? What do you think everything that's just happened over the past 2 weeks does to nuclear proliferation over the next 5, 10, 20 years?
Oh, I mean, I really don't know for sure, but I would think that there's a very great danger that it's going to reinforce the lessons of North Korea, Iraq, and Libya, which is you better get a nuke to keep America out, and you better hurry before it's too late. Now, for the Saudis, they're not going to do that because they're obviously a very close American client state, so it's a different dynamic there. But for any country that has trouble with the United States or is worried about the future of their ability to maintain their national sovereignty, obviously getting their hands on an A-bomb as quickly as possible has been, re-incentivized to a great degree. Also, I'm really worried about the future of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, where the nuclear weapon states promise to respect the right of non-nuclear weapon states to civilian nuclear energy, and where here you have a non-NPT signatory nuclear weapons state, Israel, launch an aggressive war against an NPT signatory that was not attacking them and was not making nuclear weapons, and with the assistance of the world empire, the United States, another nuclear weapons state signatory to the NPT. And I don't really take this that seriously, but it's worth at least listening to, is Medvedev, the once and probably future president of Russia. He said, oh yeah, well maybe we'll just give them a nuke, or kind of implied maybe get Pakistan too. Now, for people familiar with like Key and Peele, Medvedev is sort of angry Obama, right, for Putin. That skit where it's like Obama talks all calm,
like anger translator.
Peele goes off like an angry black guy kind of character.
He's
right?
been going nuts on Twitter.
Medvedev, he goes way out, above and beyond, but I think he's probably acting on instructions to talk that way. And it is a real risk that the NPT could just fall apart when it becomes when it's treated so callously by the United States, who invented it and insisted that the rest of the world adopt the thing to such a great degree.
Trump did say, "Don't use the N word." He talked down to Medvedev.
That's right. Yeah, he did.
Throw around the nuclear word.
Yeah, well, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, good. And he's right. He's right in that. It's not. It's
and look, the Pakistanis
thing.
Could give a nuke to Iran, who are their friends. I think not the tightest of allies. I'm not saying I predict that, but there's a danger of that. Now, when it comes to, Eastern Asia, obviously there's a concern about a Chinese threat to Taiwan, but nobody thinks China's coming for South Korea or Japan. The question of Taiwan is one that's very different because, as the American president agreed with Mao Zedong 50 years ago, Taiwan is part of China and eventually will be reunited, although we hope that's not by force. Since then, they have essentially abandoned Marxism, although it's still a one-party authoritarian state, but they've essentially abandoned Marxism, adopted markets, at least to the degree that they've been able to afford to now build up a giant naval force that is capable of retaking Taiwan. And so I think the way to prevent that is not for making a bunch of threats and setting examples in other places about how tough we are, but to negotiate with the Chinese and the Taiwanese and figure out a way to reunite the two in a peaceful way in order to prevent that war from breaking out. Because in fact, we don't really have the naval and air capability to defend Taiwan. We could lose a lot of guys trying and probably kill a lot of Chinese trying, but in the end, they'd probably take Taiwan anyway. We'd have lost a bunch of ships and planes, for nothing. So we can negotiate an end to that. And then even if America just withdrew from the region, we could still negotiate long-term agreements between China, Japan, South Korea, and whoever. There's no reason to think that everyone would make a mad scramble to a bomb to protect them if the moment they are out from under America's nuclear umbrella and so forth. And the fact of the matter is that, the greatest threat to the status quo as far as the nuclear powers go probably is what just happened. America and Israel launching this war against a non-nuclear weapon state as a member in good standing of this treaty throws the whole, as they call it, the liberal rules-based world order into question. I mean, if these rules repeatedly always apply to everyone else, but very often not to us, then are they really the law? Or this is just the will of men in Washington, D.C. And how long do we expect the rest of the world to go ahead and abide by that? If, a deal is a deal until we decide, as Bill Clinton said, to wake up one morning and decide that we don't like it anymore and change it. That was a phrase from the founding act of 97. Maybe we'll wake up one morning and decide that we don't want to do something else entirely.
Is that your Bill Clinton impression?
No, I'll spare you.
Okay.
That was pretty good.
After the show, when we're not recording.
Yeah.
Can I respond to a couple things here? Just really quickly. I'll try to do it quickly. First of all, the notion that Iran is in full compliance with the NPT is just not the case. The International Atomic Energy Agency has made it clear in report after report after report that Iran is in violation of its obligations under the protocols of the IAEA, under the requests that the IAEA have made, and under the NPT. So they're a serial violator of the NPT, unlike all these other countries we've been talking about that are our allies. Second is this quote, Iran is not attacking Israel. That's quite an amazing quote, which kind of ignores, I think, 50, 60 years of Iranian attacks against Israel, including suicide bombings and missiles and drones and October 7th. And it's indisputable that Iran has been attacking Israel, and they've been doing it for many years through their terror proxies that they fund and finance and weaponize. And since October 7th, they directly struck Israel with hundreds of ballistic missiles in April and October of last year. So this notion that before 12 days ago, Iranians were just playing nice with the Israelis, and the Israelis just came out of the blue. Well, you said, quote unquote, Iran is not attacking Israel. So, I mean, it's just not true.
Yeah, they were not in a state of war until Israel launched a state of war. That's the fact.
Yeah, they were at war.
That. You go, oh, well, they backed a group that did a thing. Yeah, okay.
That killed thousands of Israelis, maimed thousands of Israelis.
But that attack was not ordered in Tehran. The Wall Street Journal says that U.S. intelligence does not believe that Tehran ordered that attack. Like, they found out about
what the Wall Street Journal
says
and what the U.S. intelligence says, and we can dispute whether they directed it on October 7th. Everybody knows indisputably that Iran financed Hamas, provided Hamas
so did
with
Israel.
Weapons. Just a second. Provided Hamas with weapons, that the IRGC and the Quds Force were training Hamas. Hezbollah, backed by Iran, was training Hamas. There were 3 meetings before October 7th, one in Beirut, one in Damascus, and one in Tehran, where the IRGC, Hezbollah, Hamas, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad were together. There was a meeting in Tehran that was attended by Khamenei, the supreme leader. Now, at those 3 meetings right before October 7th, maybe they're discussing the weather. Maybe they were discussing Persian poetry. I don't know, but it is hard to believe they weren't discussing something. And the fact that they had armed Hamas, financed Hamas, and weaponized Hamas suggests to me that there is pretty overwhelming evidence that Iran has been at war with Israel for decades.
Critics of Israel will say that Benjamin Netanyahu has also been indirectly financing Hamas by allowing the funds
and
going.
They'll say that America backs Israel, so anything Israel does is America's responsibility too, under that same logic, right?
I think you started to make a point disagreeing with Scott about that they're not a good member of the NPT.
That's all tiny technical violations. None of that has anything to do with weaponization. It's always, oh yeah, how do you explain this isotope? And they go, well, it must have came with the Pakistani junk that we bought from Akicon. And then later that's verified. And they go, yeah, well, we want to inspect this. Let us. And they go, no. And then they do a year later and then they find nothing there.
Yeah, that's just not the case.
That's
just
the entire history of Iran, of the IAEA's objections to Iran.
So your listeners, I know they're not going to do it because it's a lot of technical
nothing to do
reading,
with weaponization.
but just go out and
diversion
read
of nuclear
IAEA
material.
reports dating back at least 20 years, and you'll see the IAEA meticulously, methodically, dispassionately outlining all of the violations that Iran has embarked on of the NPT.
Virtually all those are resolved later. They won't answer this, and then later they do. They won't answer that, and then later they do.
And many open files are still there. I mean, just again, like I just want your viewers to walk away from this conversation thing. Okay, that's interesting. I didn't know that, and that I'm going to go fact check Mark and fact check Scott and just kind of see what this is all about, right? Because otherwise, it's just he says, she says, or he says, he says. The fact of the matter is that Iran has been in violations of its obligations under the NPT, under the additional protocol it never ratified, under its safeguards obligations under the NPT. It suggests a pattern of nuclear mendacity.
They abided by the additional protocol without having ratified it. They abided by it for 3 years and did not proceed with any enrichment at all, as long as they were dealing in good faith with the EU, until W. Bush ruined those negotiations and closed them down. Only then did they begin to install the centrifuges at Natanz.
It's always the Americans that screw things up.
You complain they didn't ratify the thing, but they abided by it for years.
So that's an interesting
They were in violation of it.
But I think a more pragmatic and important disagreement that we already spoke to is, how do we decrease the incentive for Iran to build nuclear programs, not just in the next couple of years, but in the next 10, 20 years? Well, that's, you're mocking that. There's a lot of people that will, there's neocons that say basically invade everything, let's make money off of war. But there's people that will say that, Operation Midnight Hammer is actually a focused, hard demonstration of strength, a piece of strength. That is an effective way to do geopolitics. I mean, there's cases to be made for all of it.
If we're really lucky.
Yeah, so it's a big risk, is your case.
So here's some practical recommendations that I think the United States should follow. I think the first is, get the Iranians back to Oman, negotiate with them, and do a deal. Again, the deal has to be no enrichment, full dismantlement. I think for the reasons we talked about today, Scott and I passionately disagreed, but that's fine. This is a reasonable debate. Neither of us is crazy. Neither of us is irrational. It is, what would it take to get a deal with Iran? I say this is the deal. This has to be our red line. Scott disagrees. That's fine. But we got to get a deal. In that deal, we got to provide them financial incentives, right? We're going to have to lift a certain number of sanctions because they're going to have to get something in return. Okay. We can argue about exactly how much, but I think our opening negotiating position is no sanctions relief, and then we'll get negotiated down from that, right? I mean, I think a lot of this is about, how do you position yourself for a negotiation? How do you come in with leverage? And then how do you find areas of compromise where you satisfy your objectives? One is Oman. Two is the credible threat of military force needs to remain, right? Khamenei needs to understand that the United States of America and Israel will use military force to stop him from developing nuclear weapons. If he didn't believe that before 12 days ago, he now believes that. And I think that's the credibility of that military force has to be maintained in order to ensure that he does not break out or sneak out to a nuclear weapon. I think that's absolutely critical. Third is, I think we have to reach agreements with all the other countries in the Middle East to say, hey, listen, we're demanding zero enrichment and full dismantlement from the Iranians. You don't get enrichment and you don't get a nuclear program that is capable of developing nuclear weapons. Our gold standard is the American standard. Civilian nuclear energy, like 23 countries, no enrichment and reprocess. We should be consistent. We should be consistent not just with American allies, but also very clear with American enemies. I think that's the third important thing we do. Fourth is I think it's really important that we find some kind of accommodation between the Israelis and the Palestinians. We can go down many rabbit holes on that, but I think that lays the predicate for a Saudi Israeli normalization deal that then brings in multiple Arab countries and Muslim countries. And finally, is we talked about the Abraham Accords. I think we need to start thinking about what do the Cyrus Accords look like, right? Cyrus was the great Persian king, right? Who, by the way, brought the Jews back from the diaspora to Jerusalem. And Cyrus Accords would be, let's find an agreement between the United States and Israel and Iran. And that would be a remarkable transformation in the region if we could actually do that. So imagine a Middle East. And again, I know this sounds fanciful, but I think this is what Trump has in mind when he starts to talk about the things you're seeing in these truth posts, is actually a Middle East that can be fundamentally transformed, where we actually do bring peace between Israel, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the rest of these countries. I, by the way, completely agree with you on Syria. The idea that we are trusting a former Al-Qaeda, ISIS jihadist to rule Syria, I think is a big bet President Trump has made. He's made it on the advice of MBS. We'll see how that transforms or transpires and see if Syria is transformed. But the notion that somehow we should just be rolling the dice, lifting all the sanctions, and taking this former Al-Qaeda jihadist at his word is a big bet. If we get the bet right, that is actually a remarkable occurrence, because now all of a sudden Syria and Lebanon are brought into this Abraham Accords, Cyrus Accords structure. And then we actually have what I think all three of us want, is peace in the Middle East, stability in the Middle East. I don't think we need democracy in the Middle East. I think if the Middle East looked like the UAE, that'd be a pretty good Middle East. I think we'd all be pretty comfortable with that if that kind of stability and prosperity. And ultimately, you could put these countries on a pathway to greater democracy, the way that we did during the Cold War, where countries like Taiwan and South Korea that were military dictatorships ended up becoming pro-Western democracy. So that's kind of stepping back, maybe a little bit Pollyannish. But I think we should also always keep in mind what a potential vision for peace could look like.
So, Scott, as many people know, here in Austin, Texas, you're the director of the Libertarian Institute. Let's zoom out a bit. What are the key pillars of libertarianism and how that informs how you see the world?
Well, the very basis of libertarianism is the non-aggression principle, but which essentially is the same thing as our social rules for dealing with each other in private life. No force, no theft, no fraud, and keep your hands to yourself. And we apply that same moral law to government. And so, some libertarians are anarcho-capitalists, some are so-called minarchists, meaning we want the absolute minimum amount of government, a night watchman type state. In other words, just enough to enforce contracts and protect property rights and allow freedom and a free market to work. There's also, of course, natural rights theory, Austrian school economics, and a lot of revisionist history. Something very key to libertarian theory is expressed by Murray N. Rothbard, was that war is the key to the whole libertarian business. Because especially in the United States of America, as long as we maintain a world empire, makes it impossible for us to have a limited and decentralized government here at home, as our Constitution describes. And so I was going to crack a joke, but neither of you have called me an isolationist yet. But I was going to joke that, yes, as Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Isolation, the same guy, the principal author of the Declaration of Isolation, he said in his first inaugural address, "We seek peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations and entangling alliances with none." And that's the true libertarian philosophy. Think Dr. Ron Paul, the great congressman for many years up there. He was opposed to all sanctions, all economic war on the rest of the world, and the entire state of the United States as world empire. And what's strange now is that anyone who wants just peace as the standard is considered an isolationist, and people who are for world empire and a permanent state of conflict with the rest of the world, economic war, coups and regime changes, and even invasions, those are considered normal people. It's almost like people who want peace should be called cis foreign policy, because now we have to come up with a funny word to describe a normal state of being, when no one calls Mexico an isolationist state just because they mind their own business. And is there any faction anywhere in America that calls themselves isolationist? Even the paleo conservatives, who favor much more like trade protectionism and that kind of thing than libertarians, they don't call themselves isolationists. They still want to have an open relationship with the world to some degree. When isolation means like the hermit kingdom of North Korea or some crazy thing like that. No one wants that for the United States of America. What we want is independence, non-interventionism, and peace.
So to you, isolationism is a kind of dirty word.
That's right. It's a smear term invented by interventionists and internationalists to attack anyone who didn't want to go along with their agenda. The term itself is used essentially as a smear against anyone who doesn't want to go to war.
So can you actually just deeper describe what non-interventionism means? So how much sort of display of military strength should be there, do you think?
Dr. Paul said we could defend this country with a couple of good submarines, which, by the way, for people who don't know, one American Trident sub could essentially kill every city and military base in Russia. Just one. So he's absolutely right about that. A couple of good submarines are enough to defend our coast and deter anyone from messing with the United States of America. And then I admit I'm a little bit idealistic about this, that I think of that old William Jennings Bryan speech, Behold a Republic, where unlike the empires of Europe, burdened under the weight of militarism, here we have a free country. And where, you know what we could do? We could be the host of peace conferences everywhere. There are frozen conflicts in the Donbass, in Kaliningrad, in Transnistria, in Taiwan, in Korea. Virtually all the borders of Africa and Eurasia were drawn by European powers to either divide and conquer their enemies or artificially group their enemies together in order to keep them internally divided and conquered in those ways. So there are a great many borders in the world that are in contention and that people might even want to fight about. And I think that America could play a wonderful role in helping to negotiate and resolve those types of conflicts without resorting to force or even making any promises on the part of the U.S. government, like we'll pay Egypt to pretend to be nice to Israel or anything like that, but just find ways to host conferences and find resolutions to these problems. And I think quite sincerely that Donald Trump right now could get on a plane to Tehran. He could then go to Moscow, to Beijing and Pyongyang, and he could come home and be Trump the Great. We, in fact, don't have to have especially the American hyperpower, as the French called it, the world empire. We have everything to give and nothing to lose to go ahead. And Donald Trump even talked like this. You might remember when he first was sworn in this time, he said, you know what? Instead of pivoting from terrorism to great power competition with Russia and China, I don't want to do that. I just want to get along with both of them. Let's just move on and have the rest of the century be peace and prosperity and not fighting at all. Why should we have to pivot to China? Let's just pivot to capitalism and trade and freedom and peace. That's America first.
Yeah, I've criticized Trump a lot, but I think maybe it's just rhetoric, but I think he talks about peace a lot, even just recently. The number of times the word peace is mentioned, and with seriousness, not you get like a genuine desire for peace from him. And that's just beautiful to see for the leader of this country.
And look, man, there used to be a time when a third of the planet was dominated by the communists. Right? So like, I'm not going to sit here and argue the first Cold War with you. My book's about the second one and I'm not as good on the first. But since the end of the first Cold War, we have let the neoconservative policy of the defense plan and guidance of 92 and rebuilding America's defenses and the rest of this American dominance centered policy control our entire direction in the world. It's led to the war on terrorism in the Middle East. 7 countries we've attacked. It's led to the disaster in Eastern Europe, and it's leading toward disaster in Eastern Asia, when there's just no reason in the world that it has to be this way with the commies dead and gone. And again, to stipulate here, the Chinese flag is still red. It's still a one-party dictatorship, but they have abandoned Marxism. I mean, people were starving to death by the tens of millions there. It's probably the greatest improvement in the condition of mankind anywhere ever in the shortest amount of time, when Deng Xiaoping and the right wing of the Communist Party took over in that country.
Just one more thing. You mentioned the 2 submarines.